Hello everyone, in this short video I'm going to talk about how to project the outcomes of your alternatives in our 8-fold policy analysis. So for projecting outcomes, we needed to do the above mentioned things. Extend the logic of common sense. Then you choose a base case or a base option for your alternatives. Then you make not only the direction, increase, decrease, right, but also the magnitudes estimates. And some of the trends might be the base of your projections. Then you can use it, and or you can make break-even estimates that can shrink the uncertainty. And you also need to test the sensitive, whether or not your analysis is sensitive. Also confront the optimism problems and the emergent future problem. And if possible, construct outcome metrics that will help your readers to understand. And of course, keep this in mind. Policy contexts differ and matter. All right, so what do we mean by extend the logic of common sense? It means you need to use different models from economics, political science, sociology, and public administration. Now, all these models and the theory behind them need to be backed up with evidence. If you say, okay, I'm going to use public choice or incrementalism, you need to back up with the evidence. And make sure the use of metaphors behind the models. Why this is important? Because your audience, whether or not they are decision makers or the general public, they are not experts like you in policy analysis. So make sure you use some metaphors that help them to understand the policy. And you need to choose a base case. The existing conditions may be your base case because that's the easiest way to describe it, because this is the existing condition, right? And then, of course, there's many different future paths. So somewhere in between might be your various policy options. So let me give you an example. Now, for instance, let's say choose poverty rate in Rivertown. So it's 15% today. So that could be your base. So alternative A is to expect to decrease it by 2% or 1,000 fewer individuals in poverty. And alternative B is expected to decrease it by 3% or 1,500 fewer individuals in poverty. Right, so you have the base, this is 15%. You have alternative A, decrease by 2%, alternative B, decrease by 3%. But does this mean alternative B is always better than A? Not necessarily, right? You need to consider the criteria. How about cost? If the Rivertown cannot afford the cost to reduce 3%, then that may not be practically possible. It will not be politically acceptable, and the administration have no capacity to implement it. Right? Then maybe actually alternative A is the better choice, and such constraints. So you need to consider the criteria to project the outcome. And to project the outcome, as we said, not only the decrease, increase, the directions, right, but also the magnitude. How many percentages, if you can quantify it. So let's see an example. Say we expect a program to have a very positive effect on reducing unwanted teenager pregnancies. Now this is a direction, right? Because you want a positive effect in reducing unwanted teenager pregnancy. So this is the direction, but that's not enough. We need to know the magnitudes as well. So suppose, let's say, we expect this program to reduce by 100 to 300 the number of unwanted teenager pregnancy in this community over the next 5 years. This is more specific. You have a timeline, you have specific numbers, and this is in the same direction of reducing unwanted teenager pregnancies. So this is more specific than just to say we want to reduce unwanted teenager pregnancy, right? So this is the magnitude. You specify it, you quantify it. And for outcomes, we also need to think about the trends. Trend might be the basis of projection as well. Okay, say for instance, we see incrementalism, right? So incrementalism, based on the previous years, you can see the trends. So that can also be a base. So for instance, every year you have like 5% increase over the past 10 years, then it might be very reasonable to project another 5% increase in the future, right? So this is the incrementalism. All right, so we can also, when we project outcomes, we can make break-even estimates. That will shrink the uncertainty. So let me give you one example. Let's say some youth guidance-oriented policy meant to reduce incarceration of juveniles is under consideration and has none of the costs of 1 million. But the level of effectiveness is speculative. So you build a decision frame out of one is if the benefits exceeds the costs, right? The cost is 1 million, then do it. And also you know the fact that the cost is 1 million. So the step one with the break-even estimation is that you locate the point of minimum acceptable effectiveness given the cost. You can ask, what's the minimum level of effectiveness this policy would have to achieve in order to justify the spending of $1 million? Now you can answer. Different observers have different opinions about how much avoiding an incarceration is worth. But leaving that aside and going with my own value, I'd say that 15% reduction is the minimum I would accept given the 1 million expenditure. Then, step two, you're referring back to your model of the process that creates the problem and hold it in place. Ask yourself, what new processes or changes in old ones could convincingly produce this level of effectiveness? That's level effective, which means a 15% reduction. So this is largely a qualitative analysis now, right? Because you already set up the goal like 15%, but you don't really know the level of effectiveness can be achieved by what kind of new process or changes. But the answer might be, this is just an example, right? Based on previous documentation of the how the guidance process works, we can safely say that it works in different ways with different sorts of kids. When it works at all, that is, it can provide about half the kids more constructive life choices. In about a quarter of the cases, it works through heightening the realistic perception of punishment. And in about a quarter of cases, we are just crossing our fingers. So which means it's more qualitative, it's very speculative, right? The process and the changes. Then you can assess how likely or unlikely it is that the process of improvements that's identified will actually produce the required level of effectiveness, which is the break-even, right? Effectiveness. It's particularly helpful to ask whether the break-even level, 15% reduction, remember, looks like a plausible number given what is known and assumed about the effectiveness in similar circumstances of similar sorts of interventions. Now, if the number is plausible high, you might then go on to ask whether special circumstances of some sort might be at work, in this case, to help achieve it, the break-even level, 15% reduction. Note that in this and the previous step, you must rely on what we might think of as theory or self-conscious or evidence-based reasoning about the way causal process works because without these evidence, without this reasoning, it's just too wild guessing. Okay, at least you need to base on all this thinking in a reasonable way. Now, evidence-based, of course, produce you more plausible, convincing power, right? So typically, as we can see, because this is when we say break-even level, when we say the changes, you can't quantify it, you just say it in qualitative ways. So that will be the weakness, right, in the policy analysis reasoning. So this is why it's particularly important and particularly difficult to take this step as thoughtfully, self-critically, and reasonably as possible. But we try our best. All right, so the last step in terms of break-even estimation is estimate the probability of failure and the political and other costs of having to accept failure. Right? What if you ask yourself, what if the program actually doesn't work, right? 15% reduction not achieved even cost $1 million. Asking yourself whether these costs would be tolerable should they be incurred. So this is kind of the failure test in advance you need to ask yourself. All right, so for the sensitivity analysis, right? So how big a mistake can I afford in my assumptions before the analysis is in big trouble? So this is the mistake analysis or mistake tests, right? So the smaller the affordable mistake, the more sensitive is your analysis to the particular assumption. All right, so the other issue is, as scholars, sometimes we hold a very optimism in the future, right? So you need to confront the optimism problem as well. You can do so by writing the scenario and think about the undesirable side effects, and also be especially aware that the ethical costs of optimism. When you are thinking about improving something, which might not be a Pareto optimism situation, which means you benefit one group while hurting the other group, then you really need to be cautious about these ethical costs. And also, then the emergent features problem. You need to imagine yourself in others' shoes, right? So then, if these features did not work, then have problems, you need to consider governmental regulations. And finally, let's think about the outcome, how you're going to present these outcomes after you project them. Now, we project these outcomes basically means we need to compare them. So it's better for you to create outcome metrics while listing all the policy alternatives, and then you project your outcome based on the criteria you set for each alternatives. So after this, if you the outcomes can be quantified, you quantify them. If they cannot be quantified, then might be useful to use categorical measures, right? High, medium, low, etc. All right, so doing all these will help you to compare and then confront the trade-offs and finally make a recommendation. All right, so to summarize, for projecting outcomes, you need to extend the logic of your common sense and choose a base case. Usually is the existing one, then you can vary with your alternatives. And not only project the direction, but also, if possible, make magnitude estimates. You can use guesstimation, of course. And finally, construct an outcomes matrix that will help you to compare the results and make a choice and make policy recommendations. All right, that will be all for this short video. Thank you very much.